production of Sika. Funding for Firing Line is made possible by a major grant from the John M. OLIN Foundation, Incorporated. Additional support is provided by the Mobil Corporation, L. John Polite, Jr., the Friends of Firing Line, and by the financial support of viewers like you.
From Buckley, West Virginia, welcome to Firing Line. I'm Michael Kinsley of the New Republic magazine. When you think of West Virginia, you might first think John Denver, but then you think coal. Coal is America's largest indigenous source of energy. It supplies almost a quarter of our energy consumption and is responsible for nearly a third of our energy production. Coal is the one energy source that the United States actually exports in any quantity. And one more statistic, more than half of America's electricity comes from coal. As always during America's recurring crises over imported oil, coal is back in the spotlight. This is one energy source we still have plenty of. But coal mining has a bad reputation. Mining causes fatal accidents and black lung disease. Burning coal spews sulfur into the air, which in turn produces acid rain that destroys lakes and forests. Coal burning also adds to global warming through the so-called greenhouse effect. For a generation now, environmentalists and coal producers have argued over the extent of these detrimental side effects and to what extent the advantages of coal as a reliable indigenous source of energy outweigh them. That argument will continue on today's Firing Line. Carl Pope is the conservation director of the Sierra Club, the San Francisco-based conservation and environmental organization. Robert Quenon is chairman of the Peabody Holding Company, which is the corporate parent of Peabody Coal Company, America's largest coal producer, although Peabody Holding Company is now itself a subsidiary of Hanson PLC of Great Britain. Mr. Buckley, it's always been a favorite debating point of nuclear power advocates that in comparison to nuclear's almost perfect safety record, hundreds of people die every year as a result of the mining and consumption of coal. Are you proposing now to switch gears today and defend the production of coal?
I'm not proposing to switch gears anytime in the scheduled future. But I think there are two separate points. One is, ought we to encourage nuclear energy, to which I say yes. The second is, ought we to continue to use our abundance of coal, to which I would say yes, subject obviously to certain safeguards. Now, I take it you're not satisfied with the level of safety that's currently provided under the Clean Air Act?
Well, I think that the key issue in burning coal is it's fine to burn coal, as long as the people who burn it take care of the problems they create. We've made a lot of progress in the last 20 years in that regard, and this year's Clean Air Act will take us a much greater step along the way. But there remain a couple of fundamental problems, one of which is when you burn coal or oil or natural gas, although in smaller quantities, you put out carbon dioxide, which is not in the short term toxic, but which does expose us to a risk of basically destabilizing global climate. And that's a cost. You can argue about how big a cost it is, and I think that's a reasonable argument. We don't know exactly. But we think the lesson of what happened with acid rain is...
We being the Sierra Club?
The Sierra Club. And I think environmentalists in general, that when we see a problem like this, we ought to begin buying a small insurance policy early, instead of waiting until we have a crisis. The problem we have with acid rain is it's going to be much more expensive to clean it up now than it would have been if we had started in 1981, when we first became aware of the problem, and put in place a modest program at low cost that could have protected the environment over a longer period of time and at a much lower total cost to the economy. But that's not the way we do things. We like to wait for the crisis, and then we have a crisis
That's not the
solution.
Sierra Club, right?
No, but that's the American way. That's the American way.
Well, how do you handle that, Quenon? That's a lot of allegations there.
I'd like to start with what I think are the fundamentals of the thing, and that is that it is a basic, very important energy resource for the country. 60% of the electricity that's used in this country is generated in coal-fired plants. It is an abundant, secure source of energy. It is in this country. The deposits are well known. They are being developed. It's not overseas someplace and it's not off the north slope of Alaska, so that the advantages that we have from that are an abundant fuel. It's economical compared to other methods of generating electricity, whether it's nuclear or oil or gas, and it is an efficient way of using the energy. In response to the comments about the atmosphere and emissions from coal burning, we have been regulated in this country for the last 20 years under the Clean Air Act. We've made significant reductions in sulfur emissions in that period of time. As a matter of fact, since 1970, when the Clean Air Act first went in, the use of coal for electric power generation has doubled in this country, and sulfur oxide emissions have gone down by 8% in that period of time. So the Clean Air Act, as it has been implemented, has been working. The amendments that are before the Congress today, the amendments to the Clean Air Act, which will probably be passed, will result in further reductions of sulfur emissions from the burning of coal and other fossil fuels.
Are they draconian or are they...
They are a further
justified?
tightening of what have already been very tight standards already existing in this country. And
You got no objections to them?
I have no objections to cleaning up the atmosphere.
Well, let me ask you a basic question. Ms. Pope said that in his judgment, it's the responsibility of people who pull coal out of the ground or burn it to see to it that it doesn't assault other people. Do you agree with that?
I think it's important to all of us as citizens and people who are interested in the long-term health and welfare of this country that we use the resources we have in the most economical and the most effective way. We also have to use it in a way that preserves the environment. He pointed out in his comments that 10 years ago we learned about acid rain. We have known that rain has been acidic for a much longer period of time than that. 100 years. Records would show scientists were discovering that rain was acidic. In different parts of the world it's more acidic than it is in other places. It is not to be argued with that sulfur dioxide will contribute to acidity in the atmosphere, but it's only one of many contributing factors. That many of them are natural, some of them are man-made, and it's been with us a long time.
But as a philosophical generality, do you agree with this?
That the so-called polluter pays principle. Yeah. I think that the fact that society gets the benefit from the low-cost fuel, from the abundance of electricity, that perhaps society as a whole as part of the payment of whatever it takes to make this an efficient and effective fuel.
Let me get an analogy. I mean, if I had a business behind your house, and as part of this business I made big barrels of sulphuric acid, and you might benefit from my business. I might be producing electricity, and you might be burning my electricity. I don't think you'd find it acceptable for me to go and dump my barrels of sulphuric acid in your backyard, although that might be the low-cost solution for me to do. I think you might find, even if the sulphuric acid was so dilute that it was only anesthetic, all it did was kill your grass, wasn't toxic, I think you might have a major problem with that, and I think you'd be right to have a major problem with that.
That's a nuisance. That would come under the category of a nuisance.
I think acid rain is a nuisance, if you will, and we need laws that enable people to protect our atmosphere and our lakes and our streams.
I think that Congress of the United States has recognized that effluents from power plants, including sulfur oxide, should be controlled and reduced. And we've been on that course for 20 years now. And this is a further ratcheting down. This is a third succession of regulations at the federal level to reduce emissions from electric power plants using fossil fuels. And it's part of society's desire to not only clean up the atmosphere, but to pay for it as they go along in the form of higher electricity costs.
I think we presumably want the same thing with different emphases, but I'd like to quarrel with your generality also. I buy a car from Detroit, from Chrysler, and I run over your Aunt Daisy. Is Detroit responsible?
No, but you are.
Okay, I am, but they made the car.
Yes, but you're the ultimate consumer of the car.
Well, but the point is that you're saying now that the people who pull the coal out of the ground ought to pay the cost of somebody else who burns it.
No, I'm saying the people who use the coal should. I mean, I'm perfectly. The ultimate consumer is going to bear the cost. Mm-hmm. And you can debate. In fact, in 1973, at the suggestion of President Nixon, the Sierra Club tried to get Congress to put a small tax in place on sulfur oxide emissions. And if we'd done that, I think we would have avoided many of the problems we had with acid rain. We would have encouraged the development of a clean coal technology much earlier than we did. And we would have gotten a solution to this environmental cost at a lower net cost to society. That was what I meant by saying we like to wait for a crisis in this country. And then when we have a crisis, we have to implement a solution more rapidly than we would otherwise have had to do.
On the one hand, one wants to think ahead and be presciently. On the other hand, it's hard to generate political pressure ahead, as witness our failure, for instance, to stock up on our oil reserve.
When oil was $10 a barrel.
When oil was $10 a barrel, yeah.
Absolutely.
But the notion of approximate responsibility is fascinating. John Kenneth Galbraith writes 10 books. Probably the publication of those books cost the economy, what, $500 billion, you say? Or am I being modest? Now, should we be able to sue him for disseminating such
Yours
bad
must
ideas?
have cost at least that much. You're being too modest.
It seems to me that at some point there's a sort of free agency here. So I'm sort of sympathetic with Mr. Quenon's point that people who profit from the availability of coal are in some sense responsible for the overhead.
Well,
Mr. Buckley, I'd like to make one other point on that, and that is that we do get smarter as we mature as a society and as a country. And many of the things that we now know today, we know as a result of the advances of science that tell us how many parts per million there are in this piece of atmosphere or in that piece of water. I think that society is also responding to that increased understanding of the environment that we have. I find it difficult to defend myself against charges that we have done this, that, and the other in the past, when in fact we are part of a society that is moving forward together to create an environmental acceptable atmosphere. And we are ahead of the rest of the world, and I defy you to travel anywhere except a remote Pacific island to find an atmosphere that's as clean as ours is.
But you said something rather provocative a moment ago when you said, after all, 60% of our electricity is generated by coal. Well, 75% of France's electricity is generated by nuclear power. Now, they have access to coal. They can buy your coal, as a matter of fact, or coal from England, presumably. The fact that they nevertheless turn to nuclear power must suggest that, freed of some of the overhead, legal overhead especially, that we impose on anybody who wants to generate nuclear power in this country, you can make it competitive.
For France, it may have been a competitive form of generation compared to their own indigenous coal reserve. Today, if U.S. coal were imported to France, it would probably be on a par. But even the French don't absorb, the consumer does not absorb the total cost of electricity in France. The government still subsidizes that industry.
Do you think the government should subsidize electricity? I mean, is electricity something that we want to encourage people to
But
waste?
that's France, and we're talking about...
Well, we do it here
this
too,
country.
though. Of course, we have done it here.
We don't do it in the private sector. We have done it through the REAs, and we've done it through TVA, but in the private sector, we do not subsidize electricity in this country.
I would argue that historically, when we let people who consumed electricity not pay as customers the cost of air pollution, water pollution, and various other forms of medical and property damage, that was a subsidy. It was a subsidy that wasn't on the books.
In the sense that the New York Times is subsidized because the garbage collectors have to pick it up every Monday, right?
No, if the garbage collection may be subsidized because I, as the customer, don't pay for it. I said the consumers of electricity weren't paying the full cost, which is my definition of
the consumers of the New York Times aren't either. If the garbage collection is municipalized,
it's undoubtedly that's a subsidy. Well, yes, then that's a subsidy of the New York Times.
So there would be another factor of your rule.
Well, the fact of my rule is you shouldn't subsidize garbage. You shouldn't subsidize garbage collection. But yes, that's a subsidy.
In other words, you would in effect privatize the garbage collection. By the way, that's a good idea.
Well,
they do in San Francisco.
I happen to have privatized garbage collection, so I think it's a fine
Congratulations.
idea.
So now, what kind of progress are we making here? You're not against coal, and what differences are there between the two of you in respect of the current pending act as it affects coal? You think
I'm for it.
You're for it.
So I'm not sure what your position is.
It is a foregone conclusion that Congress will pass this. It may not be in the form that we would have had it had we controlled the ultimate way that bill turns out.
What would you have done to it?
We would have not put the absolute caps on sulfur emissions that have been put in the bill as it stands now. That absolute cap will preclude economic development in time unless it's removed, because what it says is that you can no longer, past the year 2000, emit any more sulfur in the atmosphere than what is being done at that time. Well, this
That's so realistic, isn't it?
population is going to grow. We're going to hope that the economy grows. There's going to have to be more electricity generated. We hope that technology will come and improve to reduce the sulfur. But if it doesn't, if it's 20 years rather than 10 years, we could see an economic slowdown in this country as a result of shortage of electricity.
Let me point two things. Wait. It's not. The technology that is needed to reduce that already exists. We certainly do hope there will be cheaper technologies, and I think we can count on that. Technology hasn't stood still since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, as you've often pointed out, and it's not going to start standing still next month for any reason I can detect. But we already have technologies that we have not fully deployed, which could reduce the emissions of sulfur at a faster rate than any plausible rate of economic growth. Now, I don't think we need to. I think the package we got in the Clean Air Bill takes care of the environmental damage that is caused by sulfur pollution. So I think we can quite reasonably say this is how much our biological systems can handle, and we put a cap, and then we let people deploy better technology.
I think Mr. Quenon objects, as I tend to do it, to a bunch of congressmen sitting down and setting these abstract goals. Since now, cars have to make an average of 27 miles per gallon. It's a little bit like saying people should have a minimum wage of $15. The answer is the technology may be there, may not be there, and if you can squeeze that technological jar sufficiently to make that, you might be charging $25,000 for an automobile, and we don't want that, right? So it's got to be a function of the maturation of technology, does it not?
I think we need to do several things. First of all, you can't set impossible goals, but most of the time the goals that Congress sets, because as we saw recently, they're not terribly courageous in general. They tend to set rather modest goals. And in fact, industry has typically had almost no problem meeting the goals which Congress has actually set. Now, I agree with you. Maybe if I set the goals, we might have some problems. But I'm not getting to set the goals. I also think we need to do a much better job of gearing what we do to a system that provides people with incentives to get there. We just had in California a bill which would have said, until the governor vetoed it, that if you buy a car that is more fuel efficient or cleaner, you'll get a reduced sales tax on it. And if you buy a car that is less fuel efficient, you'll pay a higher sales tax.
I like that. I like that very much. I like that. There's a geophysicist at the University of Arizona who says, look, in the sky there is a huge vat that accepts X amount of garbage. When you spill over it, you do a lot of damage. Now, the liberal approach tends to be nobody will put anything into that vat. The free market approach is everybody can put a certain amount in, but if you exceed your ration of it, then you have to pay for it. And therefore, the cost would therefore keep Cadillac from, keep them from making cars that go 2 miles a gallon or whatever it is.
Well, or if they do, you will pay very handsomely for them, and therefore they'll only get few of them, and they won't use very much of them. So that's fine. You know, if somebody wants to pay an extra $30,000 to drive a Ferrari, they can probably afford it.
Is technology approaching its going at a speed that allows you to anticipate that by the turn of the century you can meet these goals or not?
Yes, I think that's possible, and I really would like to go back to the point of technology, because particularly with the issue of global warming, which was Mr. Pope mentioned, the solution to carbon dioxide emissions, which is thought to be a precursor of global warming, really lies in the technology of electric power generation. We have in the lesser developed countries outside the industrial countries about a 25% fuel efficiency. In this country we have about a 35%. New technologies will take us to 40% fuel efficiency. What that means is that by putting modern new technologies in new plants in developing countries, we can not only give them more electricity, we can give it to them with a lower level of emissions of carbon dioxide. So that
at the same cost?
At the same cost.
In fact, I would argue in many cases at lower cost, because they're wasting so much right now.
Yes, yes. So the debate about global warming really is one that will be settled on technology, on the grounds of technology and the use of technology available and technology under development. I think that for Congress or European community or any other body that wants to set standards for people as to what you can do and what you can't do, has first got to take recognition of the technology that's evolving, that is in use in many places and will in time provide for growth by letting us have the same level of electricity with lower emissions or a higher level of electricity generation with the same level of emissions we have today.
Well, would you discriminate against those coal sites that generate that have coal that has a high amount of sulfur dioxide? That is to say, my impression is that the coal from this part of the world is more toxic than the coal from the western part of the United States.
No, it has the coal in this part of the world is also a low sulfur coal. The coal from the west is low sulfur. There are higher sulfur coals in the country. But under the laws that we operate under today, these emissions are controlled by federal standards. We had standards that came in 1970. We had standards that came in 1978. We're now going to have standards that will come in 1990. Each has resulted in a tightening of the emission levels on power plants. So we are tightening things up as we go along.
So for all intents and purposes, they let out an equal number of toxic effluents.
They are controlled to meet federal standards so that they do not exceed certain levels of emissions. And
somebody may burn a very clean coal and put out less than they're allowed to because that's the cheapest coal they have available to them.
Right.
But nobody can put out more. And actually, under this new bill, if they do that, they can sell that increment to somebody else who needs it.
Well, now, since Sierra Club is interested in these questions, has it ever made a declaration in favor of the development of nuclear energy?
No, because we believe that, in fact, if you look at the experience with this country, which is the only experience we know in detail, the evidence is that the nuclear industry has been unable to deliver on three basic promises that we think it needed to deliver on. One, it hasn't been able to solve its safety problems. Two, it hasn't been able to generate reliable electricity. And three, it hasn't been able to generate electricity at a cost which, in fact, is very attractive, as I'm sure Mr. Quenon agrees. Now, there is a conceivable nuclear technology which might do that. And we have not said and do not say, oh, my God, you should never look at this, you should not do research in it. We have simply said, let's see a technology that is really has advantages, demonstrated advantages over the alternative, and so far there isn't one available.
Well, I had a guest from MIT who said that it is available, but that nobody is willing to sink $5 billion of capital in it because there isn't legislation there that will guard you from the praying Jane Fondas of this world who will nip you to death in court before you can get the thing cranked up. But incidentally, on your point about not delivering electricity, how do you account for the fact that most of Chicago has nuclear electricity?
But if you look at the actual performance of the plants, the reliability, the amount of time that they're online, it has not been a good track record. Your plants are much better. Your plants are available much more of the time. And that's an important thing for utility. If I'm a utility customer...
You're talking about health, you're talking about...
reliability. Is the plant operating 80%, 70%, 60%, or as we've seen with many of our nuclear plants, 45% of the time?
Is this a statement with which you have no problem?
I don't agree with Sierra Club's position on nuclear power. I think we need nuclear power in this country as an important component of the energy formula. We need electricity generated by nuclear plants, just as we need electricity generated by coal-fired plants. I think it's a mistake if we don't pursue that technology, and I hope that we will pick it up again, but for the next 10, perhaps 20 years, we're not going to see any significant increment of nuclear power coming into the equation in this country because it takes that long to build a plant, and there are none of them on the drawing boards now.
Why don't we get the French to build them for us?
That makes it even more important that coal be available and that coal be regulated in a way that it can be used so that power generation from coal-fired plants can continue to grow and continue to have acceptance by the public. That's what the nuclear industry lost, the acceptance of the public of their products. And we have not lost that. Much of the squabbling that goes on between environmentalists and producers is over how are you going to influence the public. And if the public gets influenced to the point where they don't like coal because they think coal's a baddie because someone told them it was, we're out of energy options in this country.
Excuse me,
Let me-
Mr. Pope, I have to interrupt at this point and ask Mr. Buckley a question. The coal companies say now that the old Clean Air Act of 20 years ago actually has worked quite well, and that this is a reason perhaps not to have as aggressive a new Clean Air Act as we would hope. This is a very common type of argument in debates about reforms of any sort. You think of the Civil Rights Act, the people who are most aggressive about claiming that they are the true keepers of the flame of the old meaning of the Civil Rights Act and therefore oppose the civil rights lobbies who want to extend it, are people who very often opposed the Civil Rights Act before. Isn't it an inherently suspicious argument that any given reform, by a wonderful coincidence, has gone just exactly far enough, and to push it any further would be a terrible mistake, although everything that has come up to this point has turned out perfectly?
I think that's a question having to do with public psychology. We get used to some pretty unpleasant things, and I think without overtaxing myself, I could point to a lot of laws which are commonly accepted, which I don't think there's any philosophical justification for, like the progressive income tax, for example. So the fact that we're used to this particular 20-year-old act and that the coal industry has accommodated to it does not necessarily mean it was the best approach. It might
But he
be a
hasn't
better
really
approach.
accommodated
I don't think
to
the
it.
Civil War was the best approach to the problem of slavery, by the way.
But Mr. Quenon hasn't merely accommodated to it. Mr. Quenon apparently believes that the Clean Air Act was a great success.
No, I would just like to make the point that no debate over public issues ends in the first round. We all have our own positions. We represent our own interests. We do the best to bring them forward, to have the public opinion influence one way or the other. And the fact that something that happened 20 years ago may not have been the ultimate model of legislation. It was heatedly debated then. It was heatedly debated now. It will be heatedly debated 20 years from now when there's further environmental
That
legislation.
means there were two sides if it was
That's
seriously
the
debated.
process that we work under in this country.
Thank you, Mr. Quenon. Thank you very much, Mr. Pope. Thank you, Mr. Kinsley. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you, Mr. Buckley.
Funding for Firing Line was made possible by a major grant from the John M. Olin Foundation, Incorporated. Additional support is provided by the Mobile Corporation, L. John Polite, Jr., the Friends of Firing Line, and by the financial support of viewers like you. This program was produced